All right, we good to go? Welcome everyone. I know people are going to trickle in, but my name is Joel French. I'm the Executive Director at Public Interest Alberta. And I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today virtually across Alberta is Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory. These are traditional meeting grounds for Indigenous peoples, and we want to convey our deepest respect for the history, languages, cultures, and lands of First Nations and Metis peoples. So I want to introduce the hosting organizations. We are co-hosting this with the Council of Canadians, and I want to give a shout out to Christina, their regional organizer, for being a big part of helping to put this together. The Council of Canadians is a grassroots-based organization that empowers Canadians to hold their governments and corporations to account on issues of democracy, trade, healthcare, climate, and water. Since 1985, the Council of Canadians has been a home for people who believe a better world is not only possible, but necessary. Their work has always been built on a strong foundation of timely and strategic campaigns, and currently a core focus for them is the Green New Deal Communities campaign. The Council of Canadians is working to support and connect local campaigns on a Green New Deal across the country, and you can learn more and get involved in building a Green New Deal at canadians.org/Green New Deal. So check that out. My organization, Public Interest Alberta, is a progressive political advocacy organization that engages Albertans in discussions and actions focused on building a healthier democracy, a cleaner environment, and stronger public services. We work to foster increased cooperation between organizations and individuals across sectors for advocacy related to those issues. Our work is based on the values of social and environmental justice, fairness, and equality, and you can learn more about us on our website at pialberta.org. So I want to give you a bit of an event overview, give you a little bit of a technical explanation to tell you how you can interact with us throughout this event, and then introduce our speakers. So to give you an idea of why we decided to organize this event, elected officials generally, and our governments in particular at all levels, they've really failed to put forward a bold agenda to make our country, our province, and our communities more equal, more just, and more fair. So in framing this event, we deliberately put a positive focus on how we can build a vision for what we want to see instead of what we're seeing from our decision makers right now. So we believe that requires building a broad public understanding of what is necessary and creating that public pressure because we know that politicians tend not to lead, but rather to follow. And if we can create a strong enough movement within civil society to demand those things from our politicians, that's the only way that we're going to get there. So as far as our format for today, our four amazing speakers that we've got are going to give their initial remarks, and then I'll moderate a discussion between them and you, the audience and participants. So you'll be able to make comments or ask questions, and you can participate in that way. The chat function can be used to speak to all attendees and panelists. There's a separate Q&A box that you can bring up on the bottom of your screen. And if you want to ask questions of the panelists after they've finished their initial remarks, that is the best place to put a question. Sometimes questions can get lost in the chat, and we might not notice them, especially if there's a lot of chat activity. So please put your questions in the Q&A function. We likely won't get to all of the questions and comments. We have had 250-ish people RSVP that they're coming to this, and I see that our numbers are continuing to grow. So there's a lot of folks in this event. If you are using audio to speak to the discussion part of the evening, try to be close to your microphone for that. Also, this event is being recorded so that we can post the video later, and you can then share it with other folks, your friends and networks, if you think that there have been some valuable things said here this evening that you think they could learn from as well. With that, I'm going to just very briefly introduce all four of our speakers, and then they will speak in the order I introduced them. Starting off with James Hutt. James is the Senior Manager of Programming at The Leap. Our second speaker is going to be Emily Riddle. She is a Nahio writer, researcher, and library worker. She's a member of the Alexander First Nation and a member of the Yellowhead Institute Advisory Board. She will be followed by Roland Schmidt, who is the president of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, Edmonton Local number 730. And last but not least, Batul Ghulam Hussain is the digital and communications coordinator at The Leap, and she's also an organizer with Climate Justice Edmonton. So without further ado, I'll let James take it away.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, as Joel mentioned, my name is James Hutt, and I'm calling in from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, also known as Ottawa, and just really trying to situate that in terms of the context of what we're talking about tonight, because when we're talking about Green New Deal, when we're talking about people's bailout, we have to really reckon with our history and the fact that these things have to confront the histories of injustice in which our countries, in which the relations we live in, have been founded upon. And in particular, when we reference the Green New Deal, that the original New Deal it references was not equal. It left out tons of people. So I just want to start by having that point in mind when we're talking about the world that we actually want and are willing to fight for. The other thing I'm going to say is that my computer is aging, and I have a noisy laptop fan. So if it gets really loud, it sounds like a ticking time bomb. I swear I'm not going to explode. Just bear with me, and eventually someday I'll buy a new computer. And I also want to acknowledge that this talk was originally planned to be around hope and around building the fight for better public services. But to really acknowledge that this moment we're in is really hard. Things are hard and difficult right now. Obviously, we're in the middle of a global pandemic that has killed thousands of people here in Canada. And also accompanying that is an economic crisis that has thrown hundreds of thousands of people out of work. And we're seeing that has devastating impacts across the country. And that is clearly split along lines of race and gender and class, of course. Hundreds of thousands of people are, obviously the government has put out CERB, and that's helped, but many people are actually left out of that. And many people right now are struggling to pay for rent. Many are struggling to afford medicines or even to put food on the table. And I think that's especially true in Alberta. And as if that wasn't bad enough, we're seeing right-wing governments right now using this crisis to try to implement massive cuts to social services, handing out more benefits and bonuses and handovers to corporations and their friends in the CEO class. And that's everything from like cutting transit to laying off transit workers. And I mean, nowhere is a better example of that than Alberta, right? A couple of weeks into the pandemic, Jason Kenney turned around and somehow found $7.5 billion to spend on a pipeline when oil was actually valued at less than $1, or actually less than zero, I think at the time. And I think it's really amazing this moment we're in, because he's also, from what I hear from my colleagues and friends in Alberta, is that he's actually making it illegal to protest in many ways, making it illegal to take collective action. And then on top of that, we see cops and RCMP officers murdering Black, Indigenous, and racialized people almost daily here in Canada. We hear about it in the US, but it also happens all the time here in Canada. Just on Sunday, Ijaz Chowdhury was in Mississauga, who was a 62-year-old man, was shot and killed by the police. His family had called the police and asked for their help so that Ijaz could take his medicine. And within 20 seconds of arriving, they shot him. So this is a really heavy and hard moment we're in. So with that in mind, what is there actually to be hopeful about? For me, where I draw hope is that the current governing ideology that has shaped all of our lives is currently breaking apart at the seams. For over 4 decades, the economic ideology that's governed us, neoliberalism, has insisted that there is no alternative, that the only thing we can do is cut social services, defund, privatize, reduce the role of government, and hand that over to corporations to enrich themselves and their CEOs, while all the costs and the responsibilities are handed down to individuals. And at the same time, there's been a concentrated attack on workers and workers' rights. We see back-to-work legislation used all the time, violating the ability to take legal strikes. And then We see that back to work legislation is being passed even when it's unconstitutional, and companies are getting injunctions. And so in the midst of all this, this theft of public wealth, of workers' rights, of the profits that we make ourselves as workers and working people, that's being enforced by police. If workers are on strike and the company gets an injunction, who shows up to enforce it? The police. If you can't afford to pay your rent, who ends up evicting you? It's the police. If you can't afford to take transit to get to your job, even in a pandemic, who enforces that? It's transit police. And so what's actually hopeful about that is that this myth is suddenly being shattered. We were told that wealth would trickle down, and now, in the midst of a crisis, we're seeing governments everywhere abandon that myth completely. Suddenly now no one believes in austerity anymore. When COVID and the accompanying economic crisis hit, suddenly everyone admitted that we needed massive public intervention. We needed stronger social services to protect people and keep us all healthy. Suddenly, people were talking about things that we'd been pushing for years. Like CERB, for example, is the largest government stimulus spending since World War II. And we're seeing around the world that things that were almost politically impossible 4 months ago are now suddenly on the table. Countries around the world are nationalizing long-term care and healthcare. Other countries like Spain are talking about a universal basic income, and here in Canada, workers in grocery stores, for example, and long-term care homes are getting top-ups and increased pay. And that should be more, but it's obviously a huge improvement from the past. And we've got people like the governor of the Bank of Canada coming out and saying that there's no limit to the spending that Canada should do to get out of this crisis. So we're seeing the logic shift fundamentally away from neoliberalism to a new one that we're in power of shaping here. And we're seeing that the things that we almost didn't dare to ask for months ago are now becoming common sense. So that's one big reason to have hope. The second is that millions of people are quickly becoming politicized. We are living through the largest social uprising in my lifetime, and probably most of the lifetime of people on the call. Right after the pandemic hit, we saw mutual aid networks develop in cities across the country where people volunteered to help one another to deliver food, groceries, masks, and other needed supplies. When the economic impacts were felt and people were struggling, we saw campaigns for rent strikes in dozen cities across Canada and movement on a national scale with nonprofits and others supporting the call to cancel rent. Here at The Leap, one of my favorite projects is our work that we do with workers in Oshawa. So these are auto workers at the now closed General Motors plant in Oshawa, Ontario. After about 100 years, the giant General Motors company pulled out, shut down the factory, and never paid a cent back of all the government bailouts that they took, and laid off thousands and thousands of workers, about 10,000 directly, 5,000 indirectly. We've been working with those workers to propose an alternative, that is to take the plant into public ownership and to retool it for electric vehicles and battery electric buses. They put out a feasibility study and have been gaining ground. And then when the pandemic hit, they shifted to say, listen, we need more medical gear. We need more PPE, more masks. And here we have this behemoth of a factory sitting empty. And we as auto workers and manufacturers have the skills to do that. And so they started pushing on it, and they've actually won a concession from the government. The government has pulled General Motors back in on a contract to start producing PPE for others around the country, bringing back a small portion of those jobs. But it opens up the door to much more. It opens up the door to public ownership and to retooling for the public good. And of course, right now, across North America, we're seeing protests everywhere in support of Black lives. We're seeing Black Lives Matter movements happening not just across North America, but in European and Australian cities, really everywhere. And in many cities that it's happening, we're seeing the largest demos that they've ever had. Here in Ottawa, it was the largest demo about a week and a half ago. Despite COVID, despite all of the potential risks, we're seeing people take that risk to come out in support of one another and act in solidarity. And these are thousands of people who've never been politically active before. And we're seeing the analysis develop so sharply and so quickly. And that's absolutely amazing. So much so that we're seeing big organizations and politicians trying to catch up. We're seeing movements now to defund the police and invest in things that actually help us, that make our society better, that aren't just the enforced theft and of public services and of workers' rights. We're seeing city councilors across the country vote on whether or not to do it. And I think Batul is going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But we're actually even seeing now several members of the NDP in federal government support the call to defund police. That was unthinkable for decades. And then last Friday, I think, time's hard to measure under COVID, but I believe it was last Friday for Juneteenth, we saw the International Longshore Workers Union, in support of Black Lives Matter, shut down 29 ports across the west coast of the United States, disabling those ports, shutting down economic activity, and in fact, having accompanied marches and rallies and shutting down much of the economic activity on the west coast. And the power of that is huge. So it's in this moment that we find ourselves, and the LEAP is pushing for a people's bailout. What we're trying to do is to speak to the moment to provide changes in 3 phases. So we're trying to provide demands that provide relief to the immediate crisis, that help us recover in the long term, and to help us avert future crises, and then to reimagine our society in a fundamentally just and more sustainable way. So we've launched the People's Bailout. The peoplesbailout.ca is the website, and we've launched with 3 sectors so far, focusing on health, work, and housing. We've talked to grassroots allies, partners to elevate the demands, everything from like canceling rent and rent strikes to building more co-op housing to around more PPE for workers and manufacturing it here. And then we're about to launch the food sector as well. And so we're working in deep partnership with allies, trying to send resources and amplification and support to people who are mobilizing on the ground, but to fundamentally connect the organizing that's to respond to the crisis to this long-term vision of a better world, because we're in a moment where that is now politically possible. And right now we're seeing that under COVID, the logic of capitalism is being strained and challenged. And so our work is to challenge the logic of that, the logic that says who's valuable, the logic of what work is valuable and who is it done by. And it's been quite clear since day one of the pandemic that who creates value in our society. It's not CEOs, it's not bankers, but it's actually transit workers, it's healthcare workers, it's people in long-term care homes, it's the migrant workers who grow our food and who have been dying. And so we are pushing to fundamentally challenge the logic of that work that we're calling care work. So that is caring for one another, caring for people in long-term care homes and healthcare, but also thinking of transit workers and farmers as well, and challenge that to be fundamentally more valuable in our society, because those jobs are already low carbon and good for us. They provide many of the benefits that make our communities rich and healthy. And the next place we're going with this, we're going to keep launching sectors for the People's Bailout and pushing forward these demands. But the next thing we're really looking forward to is tackling long-term care and continuing care. Because right now we're seeing that about 85% of the deaths under COVID in Canada have actually happened in long-term care homes. And so there's been movement by a number of unions and allies and the health coalitions in particular, and we're seeing that be called to nationalize or provincialize, that is to take the profit out of care, being picked up by the CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, and the NDP and others. And so what we're trying to do right now is actually expand that vision, to go beyond long-term care to home care as well, and even bigger, to broaden the frame to say take the profit out of all care. And so we're working with unions, we're working with allies to put forward that bold demand and to fundamentally reimagine what continuing care could look like. We know other countries do it better. Could our long-term care systems have better paid workers with better job security and better protections, meaning they don't have to work in multiple homes? Could they have dementia villages? Could they have childcare there too? Could they be retrofitted and top of the line built for green building? Could they have solar panels? How do we fundamentally reimagine this in a way that provides support and benefit to all society? And the last thing I'll say before Joel gets out a virtual hook and pulls me off stage is that I think the power of this vision is really compelling. And it's something that we've seen here at the LEAP. one of my other favorite projects at LEAP is our work with CUPW, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, on the Delivering Community Power campaign. And I don't have time to get into all the details of it, but essentially it was a broad vision, essentially like Green New Deal before we had a Green New Deal, about how the postal system could fight climate change, could fight poverty, everything from having letter carriers deliver food, medicine, checking in on seniors and people who need support to send medical support, and converting the vehicle fleet to electric vehicles that are union made in Canada. And we saw last year when the Postal Workers Union actually went on strike and the back to work legislation inevitably came, even though Justin Trudeau swore up and down that he would never ever do such a thing. And then the police, of course, came and enforced it. What we saw happen was that in cities across the country, individuals, people with no connection to labor, showed up and actually formed community picket lines. That is, they went on strike for CUPW, the Postal Workers Union, in support of this broad, big vision that CUPW had actually put on the bargaining table and been fighting for. So many so that they'd actually been willing to shut down the postal system and help them in bargaining and get arrested for them. And I think there's so much power for what we can do there. And that's what gives me hope.
Thanks, James. Next will be Emily Riddle. Take it away, Emily.
I'll remember to unmute myself for once. Yeah, thanks, James, for that. So, ahau ni oto timite, knitasiga soon, Emily Riddle, nia nehiao skoya otse kaputagao, magani wigan amasko atse waskaiganik. So my name's Emily Riddle. I'm Nehio on my mom's side and Scottish, Danish, and a lot of other Western European nations. On my dad's side, I'm a member of the Alexander First Nation. My ancestors entered Treaty 6 about a 10-minute walk from where I am now in what's now known as Oliver, but we'll see in next year at this time, although I think the processes will be longer. And so we entered Treaty 6 at where the Alberta legislature now sits, where Jason Kenney now sits as premier. So I grew up in Edmonton on the south side. I moved back here last summer from the west coast. I was living in Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, and I always want to name that because I did a lot of learning on their lands. As Joel said, I'm the Senior Advisor Indigenous Relations for Edmonton Public Library right now, and I'm also on the Board of Advisors for the Elhood Institute, which is a First Nations-led think tank based out of Ryerson University, which I'm always really excited to promote because for a long time we've had think tanks like the Fraser Institute, etc., comment on First Nations policy without having ever really spent any time or with communities or people. And I also love to write, and I think in another life I would probably just do that rather than this work another time. So when I think about a just transition, what I deem to be most important is that it's something that comes out of local knowledge and need. And I hear this critique and response back to this critique about a Green New Deal being an American invention. At the same time, when I think about the current political structures that we're working in, and also sort of like the jurisdictional pickle that is being an Indian or someone that lives under the Indian Act and being thrown around between the provincial governments and federal governments and who is responsible for us. And we also saw this sort of jurisdictional pickle play out with the Alberta NDP were in power. They were a bit lost as to what to do with us and relating to us. So I reject the notion right now that we should appeal to the province of Alberta, or ultimately that we should organize with the idea that Alberta should remain as a political structure. This is because as a treaty person, our relationship is with the Crown. So when we entered Treaty 6 in 1876, Canada didn't exist over here. And so my ancestors adhered to this treaty in 1877. Even though this land was already Treaty 6, we adhered to it at that time. And then later we see the formation of the province and the Natural Resource Transfer Act. And these are both made in mind without treaty, and then move away towards that. So we see settlers really not live with any intention within 15 years of making this agreement. So to me, any appeal to the province to work towards the Green New Deal has to have the ultimate goal in mind, that we live within the intentions of treaty, which to me means ultimately returning large swaths of land to us. I know that lots of folks will look at the written document and say, well, this is a cede and surrender document, but that's not what the intention was and not what was agreed to in our laws. And so otherwise, if we're not moving towards living within this treaty agreement, I don't see there being any sort of ethical way for us to live together here. Otherwise, if you're not moving towards that, there isn't a reason that non-Indigenous people should live on this territory, which might seem controversial, but is fairly a basic agreement that we made with each other. And I also think that non-Indigenous people often forget that they gained rights through treaty. So it's sort of like prairie Indians, we have a lot of pride about our treaty rights. And I think that gets conflated a lot with being a status Indian too, which is something that we have to work on too, that I don't have a treaty card. A treaty is beyond that sort of agreement that we currently have with the federal government, but settlers often forget about their treaty rights. And I think it's really time for settlers to center their organizing around these rights and to teach each other what those rights are. So Indigenous people have done this intergenerational work of passing on to their children what their rights and responsibilities are. And this is despite settler governments like continuing to steal our children through residential schools, 60s scoop, millennial scoop. So we've still maintained this intergenerational knowledge, and settlers haven't done that work. So, and to just like quickly outline some, I know not everyone that's watching is in Treaty 6, but I am, and the majority of people presenting are. Some settler treaty rights that people maintain is the right to religion, so whatever religion you choose, the right to self-government, so you have the right to form your own government and whatever that might look like, whether or not that's Alberta or whatever structure you would like to imagine beyond that in a just transition, to be creative. The right to peace and goodwill from us, that we won't attack you. The right to economic activity. So and my understanding of this is that we saw this like bounty of land and saw that there was no reason for people that moved here to live in poverty. And so I always think that's kind of like one of the most perverted things, is that we have this wealthy province and that our ancestors agreed to share these lands, and that there's still people that in the city that don't have breakfast or don't have food. So, and to outline some of the rights that I maintain from the Crown, though obviously the province affects some of these things, is education, including post-secondary, healthcare, reserve lands. I think a lot of times when people talk about reserves, they're like that we threw them onto these prisoner of war camps, but it's really clear within Treaty 6 history that we wanted reserve lands to be reserved for ceremony and untouched. So the ability to hunt and fish throughout our territory, and for that our land to remain relatively intact, though with some settler settlement, was there, but we did want reserve lands to be a thing. That is very clearly outlined in our oral history. And these are things that we gained through treaty, though we maintain other inherent rights too. So I've been thinking about lately what it would mean to have an Indigenous-led just transition, because I just spent the weekend at Sundance and no one's having these conversations. Like, no one is using this sort of language of just transition on reserve. Like, we're not talking about a Green New Deal. These aren't conversations that are being had in community. And I think in order to have these robust discussions would mean that we'd have to revive our own governance systems. And just as settlers have intervened and sort of in stealing our children and that sort of stuff, have obviously inflicted this particular governance system on us through the Indian Act that we're still healing from, which means that the majority of leadership in our communities are men, cishet men, and that's not what our traditional governance looked like. And so we've seen this tension in the last year, before we had a pandemic and before all these other things that we had, these uprisings with the Wet'suwet'en territory being invaded, and large conversations around what traditional governance versus Indian Act governance would look like. And that is something that still has to happen on the prairies for us to think through, because as I've written before and thought through a lot before, that a just transition means the return of land, but it also means us returning to our own governance systems in order to govern that land as it was intended. And that's part of our own commitment to treaty, and my understanding and work that we have to do. And so in returning to sort of a settler self-government, this is why I don't participate in federal or provincial politics in official capacity, that I'm obviously commenting on them, is because you have the right to form your own governments, and we have the right to work on our own governments and how we deem that. And so how we support each other in that, I think, is something that we have to dialogue about. I know that Batul is going to talk a bit more about this too, but obviously I can't talk for 7 minutes without talking about abolition. And I've thought a lot about how police are relatively new to these territories, and we had other means of governance and protecting each other and laws that didn't have police, as well as like the rest of the carceral system and this like entire legal apparatus that we're forced to work within. And Black people have been doing this abolition work on this continent for a really long time, and regretfully, First Nations people haven't engaged with this as a like framework of liberation until now. And I don't see like our leadership particularly engaged with this yet, though I hope it will be. And so many of my friends have spoken to Edmonton City Council over the past 2 weeks about how abolishing Edmonton Police Service is possible. And I actually fully feel optimistic for once, and that is a possible thing. But we have to start having these conversations beyond municipal boundaries too. So just as Indians are in kind of a jurisdictional pickle, abolition is also a jurisdictional pickle, that we have provincial and federal prisons, that we make sure that people aren't living in poverty, because that's one of the biggest crime creators, is that people don't have, can't meet their needs. And I think that we need everyone if we're going to push for these things, and that includes people that are in prison or people that aren't able to engage politically because they're not having their basic needs met right now. The other thing that I always bring up to folks when I'm talking about a Green New Deal or discussing a Green New Deal with people, and there's something that is new in our territories too, is jobs. And I know I'm talking to a bunch of union people, and I'm also a union member, but I understand the like structure of jobs to be ultimately oppressive. And I think that if we're going to talk about and have big dreams where we're talking about a different way of relating to each other on the land and sort of like into our hourly daily life in a radical way, is that I think we need to start being creative and thinking of beyond like good jobs or jobs at all. And so I want to throw that out there too, is like that I have a great job and I have a lot of like freedom in that work, but I don't want a job. That's my ancestors didn't have jobs. That's not something we did. And so if we can think about what our life would be like, even if it's just an exercise without jobs, I think that's a valuable thing to do. And I think that that's important in talking about how we relate to land and territory, is that we've seen in the past few months that perhaps the way people are able to organize and mobilize is because they don't have these 9-to-5s. And so what would our world look like if we didn't have to work for 8 hours every day in the same way, or even if we had a 3-day weekend? So I just want to end my time off. I always return to Sylvia McAdam, and she's one of the scholars with the Yellowhead Institute when I think about land back, and she's like one of our philosophers, I would say, that is really in tune with the language in our ceremonies and that too, and as well as her parents. So she says when she's talking about land back, to give it back means to restore the livelihood, demonstrate respect for what is shared, the land, by making things right through compensation, restoration of freedom, dignity, and livelihood. And this includes Black people that live on our territories and finding a way to do collective governance with them as well. And to me, this ultimately means not having any police, prisons, no jobs, and no Alberta. Exemaga, thank you.
Great, thank you, Emily. Next up is going to be Roland Schmidt. Take it away, Roland.
Thanks, Joel. Brothers, sisters, cousins, comrades, thank you for sharing your time with us today to be a part of this very important discussion. I believe I was asked to present here to give more of a labor perspective and maybe some commentary on how the House of Labor, despite its enormous potential, could be doing more to help further these causes. Now, tonight we've already heard about people's bailout, Green New Deal. We're going to hear some more about those ideas, and these are wonderful, inspiring ideas. But I think for labor to take these ideas and maybe move them from a place of platitude and just nice talking points to actually gaining some traction and moving the needle and enforcing some leverage, we have to really consider some structural changes that need to be made. And just a way to frame this discussion, I'll talk a little bit about the Canadian Union of Postal Workers campaign that James stole a little bit of my thunder in this, but I'll come back to it. It's called Delivering Community Power. So you can check out that campaign on the website, deliveringcommunitypower.ca. James already detailed a little bit of it, but the idea was you would take a public service and use that for a foundation to not only expand public service in Canada, but, oh, thanks, brother. Not only expand it, but at the same time provide a platform for retrofitting the economy for green energy. So Canada Post, some of you may not know that it has one of the largest retail networks in Canada. So that's more locations than, say, Tim Hortons. So this idea that you would use this large retail network to retrofit all the buildings, have a green fleet, provide this like foundation for more green jobs, while at the same time using it as a outlet for postal banking, which is the other really important plank in that policy. Now, the only respectful critique I would make of this campaign is that this idea, which was part of our bargaining round over the past couple contracts, it's hard to get any leverage in enforcing these sort of demands if you're stuck in this loop of anytime you go on strike, you get legislated back to work. And so in a way, you can maybe look at me as a messenger from the future to grant you a warning. And especially with Albertans and Bill 1, you're going to see the government. It's unsurprising, anyone who pays attention to politics and what Kenny's up to and his ideology. It's going to be unsurprising the kind of maneuvers he's going to go through, but it is going to be a rude awakening for the rest of Albertans that maybe voted for him under the wishful thinking that he would somehow make the economy magical again. So really with Bill 1 or with the experience of the postal workers who, just in my time with the postal workers as an activist over the past 16 years, I've been legislated back to work twice, once under Harper in 2011 and then again under Trudeau in 2018. The really insidious thing about all this is that we supposedly have these constitutional rights to bargain and to use our labor to enforce leverage, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day if the government feels that it could attack us without reprisal. So despite Harper legislating us back in 2011 and then us doing a court challenge, which I believe 6 years later, the Supreme Court said was unconstitutional, it didn't stop Trudeau from doing it again. So this is the hard question that Labor really needs to ask itself, is that if it is committed to not only improving the lives of its members, but also forwarding any sort of campaign, whatever it might be, whether it's delivering community power for CUPW, or they want to sign up with the Green New Deal, if we want to forward these things and make them part of our bargaining packages, we have to get serious about what we're doing with our union structurally. Now, kind of the two main themes I wanted to focus on in that discussion is credibility and capacity. So I'll make a confession. Despite our very proud legacy as being a union that once upon a time defied back to work legislation, I think it was in 1979, it's pretty much been nothing but the job getting worse or losses happening since then. Now, I don't think that's from negligence or from people like willingly running away from the fight. I think this is sort of the nature of, and any union people on this call will be able to identify what we could talk about as either bureaucratic process or what I call proceduralism. So this is what we call, like with grievances, arbitration, basically the technical ways that you would make appeals or complain when the boss is violating your contract. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that because it's going to bore everybody. But the importance in that is, I believe our labor as a whole has been putting most of its resources into trying to outmaneuver the boss and the government in this procedural realm. And they're doing this with very good intention. They think if they could have the strongest arguments or, out-lawyer the other team, this is the way we're going to improve the lives of our members. Now, the sad consequence of this is it's come at the neglect or at the expense of our capacity to organize, which is the second thing I wanted to focus on. And if you're wondering why, an Edmonton president of the Postal Workers Union is on this call for ideas that are much bigger than just little old Edmonton postal workers, it's because we've taken the step in our union of really trying to push back and reclaim the work floor and really just center the struggle back on like the rank and file. So in many ways, I'm just an expression of a lot of discontent we're having in our local. There's a lot of people that after being legislated back to work twice, seeing their jobs get nothing but worse, they're really questioning, it's like, what are we gonna have to do in order to make things better? And it's really come at this push of, if we are going to challenge governments that are just using back to work legislation with impunity. It really has to come down to the only response is going to be a rank and file response. The only response is going to be unions supporting one another and finally deciding that enough is enough. This cannot stand. And it's not going to happen from big speeches at conventions. And if anyone's been to a labor convention, you're going to see no shortage of that sort of rah-rah attitude. And it's good that people are at least speaking those words of, you know, we need to fight the good fight, but we actually have to deliberately invest in the struggle on our work floors. And organizing, just like any other skill, it's not spontaneous. You have to train, you have to be deliberate, you have to have people going to work floors making the case that we need members to get involved. We need members to sign up for these educational courses, to take that training, to participate in these workshops, and then be supported and mentored in the process of fighting back. And this needs to happen in more than just one local and more than just one union. The whole labor movement has to really reevaluate what it's willing to do to fight. And there's going to be a tremendous struggle, especially for some of the major organizations in Alberta with its AEP, the United Nurses, and the healthcare workers. It's the storm that's coming for you. You all know it's coming, and we really need to be honest about press releases and court challenges and arbitrations are not gonna win the day. So if it's any indication about like the struggle we've had at CUPW and having to get serious and pushing our union in that direction, the unions in Alberta are going to have to push that as well. And just to circle that all back to what we're talking about, whether it's delivering community power or a people's bailout, it's like this idea of if a union launches a campaign, it's one thing to put on a website or have it in a bulletin. And it could be like the most wonderful idea. But if we don't have credibility with our members, we really lose the opportunity to grow these campaigns. And Brother Hutt was initially hired by CPW to promote delivering community power, and he did an excellent job. But I'm sure that he could attest that the traction would have been a lot greater if the members were inspired by the organization. So this is my way of very respectfully saying, like, this is a wonderful campaign. But if the organization isn't strong and the members aren't inspired or believing in the organization or feel that what the organization is doing to fight to win, then we really squander this wonderful, wonderful idea that could potentially transform Canada and be like a springboard for politics moving in a more progressive direction throughout Canada. So the Postal Workers Union has a tremendous opportunity to further this fight. And I'd like to think that if we get our house in order as far as properly organizing our members and being able to conduct a strike where we inspire our members to stand up to things like back to work legislation, things like delivering community power are only going to benefit as a result. So for all the folks on this call that are from labor, I just would encourage you very much to really take like a sober look at your organization if you haven't already. I'm sure just by the nature of the call, a lot of you have, but we really have to do that hard work of if our executives aren't responsive to making these changes, then what we need to do is make sure that we're gathering those ones and twos, recruiting that base of activists from work floors to be pushing in our general members meeting to put forward motions, to put forward policy of our own, and to keep like inspiring our coworkers with these ideas. And if there's that reluctance at those executive levels, well, we just got to keep pushing and then replacing those folks that don't want to see that change happening in the union, because it's not going to happen. I'm not saying abandon proceduralism or the grievance process, but if you think that we're going to win just by relying on those methods, it's going to be another 30 years of defeat for us. So it's just an appeal that if you think of the union as a bird, where one wing is at proceduralism and the other wing is at organizing, the appeal is just very basically make the wing of organizing just as strong as that proceduralism. And even at that very little gesture, you're going to see labor becoming relevant again. And everything that all the speakers are going to be sharing tonight, labor has a huge part to play. Like, I truly believe there is no power greater in the world than that of the united working class. But if we're not doing that work of putting in that training and appealing to our members and hitting those work floors, it's like we don't stand the chance of being a part of those important moments in history. Like, just imagine with everything that's happening with the uprising in the States, if more unions were positioned to meaningfully support Black Lives Matter and like make those pushes for defunding the police in all those different jurisdictions. It's like so many civil society organizations or social justice groups would just dream of having the amount of human resources and financial resources that unions have. So it's really incumbent on us to do better and to be a bigger force in that fight. So I'm sure we'll get into more discussion later, but thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Roland. Appreciate your remarks. And our final speaker with initial remarks, and then we'll get into discussion, is Batul Ghulam Hussain. Go ahead, Batul.
Hi, everyone. Wow, it feels like I have very large shoes to fill after the three incredible speakers that you just heard from. My name is Batul Ghulam Hussain, and I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I'm the Digital and Communications Coordinator at the LEAP and an organizer with Climate Justice Edmonton. I am a settler of color whose family comes from a lineage of settlers in Eastern Africa on Maasai and Kikuyu territory, and I am based in Treaty 6 here. I'm really grateful to the folks at Public Interest Alberta and the Council of Canadians for all of their hard work developing and implementing this panel tonight. It feels incredibly surreal to be thinking and speaking about a Green New Deal and a people's bailout in this political moment where it feels like everything has changed. In Edmonton, just a few short weeks ago, 15,000 people marched, demanding justice for Black communities. Dozens of people have testified in front of City Council, demanding the full abolition of the Edmonton Police Service, something I never dreamed would happen in my lifetime. And just yesterday, dozens of community members spoke at the Edmonton Public School Board meeting, demanding the full abolition of the school resource program and the promise that police officers would never again be stationed in our schools. This moment is unprecedented, as comrades across the country and the continent have been taking to the streets to demand justice for Black community members, an end to police brutality, and the abolition of police and prisons. But there's been a stark disconnect between what's been happening on the streets and what is being enacted by the Kenney government. Instead of listening to what Albertans really want, they're continuing to push through an austerity agenda that benefits no one but the rich and powerful. This week, the Kenney government passed a motion encouraging the formation of neighborhood militias to assist law enforcement, prioritize the reopening of businesses despite the clear risks that it posed to our communities, and are threatening to cut the minimum wage. But this is not outside of the game plan that we already know. Right-wing governments like Kenney's have been using the lens of austerity to uphold white supremacy in our communities for a really, really long time. It's not an accident that the exact same governments that are out here decimating public and social services are also increasing policing budgets and embedding police into every aspect of our social services, from housing to healthcare to poverty work. Think about it this way: when someone is getting evicted, who enforces that eviction? Police. When someone is in crisis and having a mental health crisis, who is called to assist them? Police. Despite the fact that we know that police don't keep our communities safe and that we have the skills and tools to do that work for ourselves. These governments posture as being tough on crime when really all they're doing is upholding the exact same white supremacist culture that the nation of Canada was built on. The policing and surveillance of Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities is a function of this white supremacist culture. It's necessary in order to justify both the continued occupation of Indigenous territories and the superiority of settler societies. It's an approach that deals with the symptoms instead of the problem, not unlike how the UCP are approaching the COVID-19 pandemic. This approach ignores the continued violence that Indigenous and Black people face at the hands of police, and the entire reason that police were created in the first place. On these territories, the history of policing can be directly tied to the displacement of Indigenous peoples. The RCMP were created to displace and dispossess Indigenous communities from their territories, and by treating police as the solution to extractive capitalism and settler colonialism, the real problems is to, quite frankly, bury our hands in the sand. I know you're all thinking, how does this translate or tie to the Green New Deal? Here's the thing. The Green New Deal is our opportunity to transform our communities and fundamentally respond to crises with care instead of brutalities. It's about how we care for each other and the planet. On these territories, a Green New Deal has to begin with the return of stolen land, like we heard from Emily already. We can't attempt to build a new system unless we fundamentally repair and redress the ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples. A Green New Deal means housing for all so that we don't need police to enforce evictions. It means well-funded mental health care so that police aren't responding to mental health calls. It means harm reduction services, a basic and livable wage, healthcare for all, accessible abortion services, trauma-informed crisis intervention teams so that police are never again called to intervene in our communities. It means a free public education system, including post-secondary, that does not include school resource officers in our schools. It means safe injection sites for every community that needs it, and proper salaries for the people who actually take care of our communities: teachers, nurses, bus drivers, caregivers. All of this is possible, and all of us deserve it. It's not just a moral necessity, it's how we respond to the crises of white supremacy, austerity, and the climate crisis. It starts by recognizing that care work is and always has been climate work. It's the work that keeps our communities going, that holds us together, that makes sure everyone is housed and fed. It's the work that's been so deeply devalued and invisibilized in our communities. But it's actually the work that truly matters. A Green New Deal that's based on care for each other and our communities means making police obsolete. It means abolishing the institution of police, a racist phenomenon that upholds state brutality, and abolishing prisons, ending the concept that justice means placing people in cages in the first place, instead of transforming the conditions that created the harm in the first place. All of this is possible when we invest in each other instead of in racist institutions that only cause harm to our neighbors. It means investing in systems of care that actually keep us safe. In Edmonton, the policing budget is $370 million. Can you imagine if we reinvested that money into housing solutions, into care solutions, into crisis-informed trauma teams, even just to 211? I made this joke on Twitter the other day, but like, honestly, if all we do with ending the money, with like redirecting the $370 million is provide free therapy to every single person that has been impacted by police brutality, then that is a better use of money than what we are currently throwing at the Edmonton Police Service. This is how we build communities where all of our neighbors are safe, instead of upholding the white supremacist status quo. I think a lot about a quote from Arundhati Roy that feels particularly relevant in this moment. She talks about how another world is coming and she is on her way, and on a quiet day we can hear her breathing. In the past few weeks, I've never realized just how close this world was. Thank you so much.
Awesome, thanks so much, Batul. Thank you to all four of our panelists for those initial remarks. Got a couple of questions coming in already. The first one, we're going to try out the audio option of this, and I've got a couple of hands up. So I wanted to start with Sandra Azakar, and we should be able to activate your mic so you can speak.
Sorry, I don't have a question.
Okay. I see
Hi,
one other
Sandra.
hand raised from Margaret Brown. Do you have a question, Margaret Brown? Not hearing you. Okay, I'm going to go to one of the written questions, and then if if Margaret still has a question, you can certainly type it in as well. So I've got a question from Avril Torrance asking if Batul and others can speak about the climate strikes, which I think have kind of gotten swallowed up by all of the changes that have happened more recently. But just wondering if folks want to comment on those happening and I guess the importance of the climate crisis and maybe connections between the climate crisis and racial violence too, if we want to talk about some intersections.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to make sure that I'm understanding the question correctly, it's about like the impact of the climate strikes and how the climate crisis connects to racial justice. Okay, perfect. I think we're in this incredible moment where like Gen Z is so much cooler than all of us and doing so much more than I mean, I did when I was their age, but you're seeing like young people be scared for their futures. We've like seen the reports. We've seen the reports from the IPCC saying that we have 11 years to actually fundamentally change our societies in order to ensure that like we have a planet that is livable. Because we've never known a planet at this heat before. We've never known a planet that looks the way that it does right now. And so you were seeing like young people lean on the tactics that have been developed by the labor movement largely in order to build momentum and build political possibility so that we are able to actually halt the current production of our society in order to actually respond to the crisis at the scale that it requires. And I think fundamentally, when I think about the ways in which that connects to racial justice, we know that racialized communities, particularly Black and Indigenous communities, are on the front lines of the crisis because those are the communities that are experiencing the devastating impacts of climate change firsthand. Those are the people who are seeing those impacts on their territories, and even thinking about like our responsibility to communities in the global South. Like the global North, like countries like Canada in the global North are responsible for like the bulk amount of emissions that are creating the crisis in the first place. But it is places like Bangladesh, like Mumbai, that are going to pay the price. And so fundamentally, we have to recognize that like addressing white supremacy, so addressing the like system that created the climate crisis in the first place, one where European settlers treated the rest of the world like their ongoing playground and thought that they could stake a claim to territories that were not theirs in order to feed rampant capitalism, means that we've created a crisis that is grounded in white supremacy and so disproportionately impacts like racialized people.
Thanks, Batul. Any of our other panelists want to jump in on that as well? Feeling good? That's a good answer.
I'll just add to it to say a word that I think Batul's quite right. And it's really amazing to see what the youth climate strikers are doing. For one, another thing that gives me hope is the younger generation, because they are far more sharper, far more smarter, and far more active than I ever was. And I think we're seeing, like Batul said, youth who are actually picking up the tools of labor without actually any real connection to labor, because most people my age are not in labor unions, and even more so for people younger than me. And so we're seeing people pick up the tools of striking and trying to take that and run with it, often with very little to no support from labor. And I think if I was running a labor union as one of the executives, I would be trying to tap into that, connect with them, to provide support, to train them about what strikes is and how they've worked in the past, what they've won, and how to bring them into the labor union. I mean, even just from a narrow, very narrow perspective of like, these people are going to be getting jobs soon and could be industry, could be organizing their professions. But even bigger than that, like I think when unions actually partner in solidarity with these broad-based coalitions, then it's incredibly powerful. And another example of things we worked on was a recent strike in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities there, where youth climate strikers teamed up with janitors that were going on strike. And so from day one of the bargaining process, they brought them in, the youth climate strikers and other organizations, and the cleaners actually put on demands for the city to meet its climate obligations, for all of the buildings they clean in to invest in a green cleaning fund, to train all the cleaners in how to use them. That is like renewable or sustainable chemicals that they're using, just better processes, and then to actually kick out the Chamber of Commerce and to stop listening to them because they found they were the biggest opponent to climate change on a municipal level. And they won, and they won huge. And these are like the lowest paid, racialized, often immigrant workers partnering with youth strikers. And so I think there's so much we could do there.
Great, thanks, James. I'm going to go to a question from Tim Penton, and I know Tim has typed us a question, but has also requested to speak. So I'll just let you speak to your question, Tim.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Thanks. I wanted to put to the panel as a whole, but I would definitely be interested to hear what, Emily, your thoughts are on sort of the question about, I like the idea of a Green New Deal, a just transition, and I do think that that needs to, whatever that might look like, that definitely does have to, we have to be looking, including that, yeah, we have to be looking at the context of, you know, this is Turtle Island, this is a settler colonial nation, and what does it mean to respect the rights of Indigenous people here in a just transition, in a Green New Deal? And I'd also like to ask your thoughts, but the panel as a whole, if you have thoughts too, in terms of this idea of like endless growth. There are some people who believe that, you know, despite a lot of hope that is put into different forms of renewable energy and transitioning our economy, that the idea of endless growth means that we just can't be living like we live right now, right? Like it's not about setting up windmills, and it's not about setting up enough windmills or solar panels or hoping in some new technology that is going to save us. Our current civilization is unsustainable. And I was wondering if LEAP, the people from LEAP there, as well as you, Emily, might have some thoughts on, with that all in mind, what would it, are there people who are talking about this, I guess, in your guys' circles about what a just transition and a Green New Deal might look like to basically have a softer landing with the environmental crisis as a whole, how we transition to that, right? Without, you know, to prevent sort of like a, you know, yeah, anyways, I'll just put that out there.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Who wants to start on Tim's multifaceted question?
I can start, I guess. Yeah, I actually, let me lob through both of these things. I think that the idea of endless growth, which I'll start with, and we have this sort of like Marxist timeline that you learn that we have capitalism now and then we will move on to this different economy. But for Nihiowak, we had a different form of economy on this land where we didn't have endless growth, where we had better relationships to land, and not always perfect either, because we overuse resources at sometimes. And I don't want to create like a pre-contact fantasy world, but we had laws that enabled us to live within better parameters with land. So I think it's ultimately really related for us to think about returning to, or what Indigenous rights look like for a Green New Deal. And we can't just vaguely talk about Indigenous rights, because that means engaging with what that looks like where you are. And for here means actually becoming an embodied treaty person and thinking about how we would actually live within this agreement. And then also, which I did not really do justice to in my, so I'm sorry to any Métis participants, but also thinking about how Métis folks fit into that as well, because this is also their territory. So I think, I think we have to enliven that agreement and return to it, and that's what will help us with both these things. If that makes sense. I would love to have other people add on to that.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Joel. I'll add a little bit here. I'll just speak to the whole idea of just like this economy of growth. So really some core features of capitalism, you're talking about crisis of overproduction and crisis of consumption. So we produce way too much, we consume way too much, and this is all really to drive market growth. So from a labor perspective anyway, when we talk about unions, unions are fundamentally about wealth redistribution, which is through the lens of kind of, you know, this is our way of trying to democratize the economy. So if we're looking at like a tangible next step, we really do have to try and empower these organizations that are in a place where like we can meaningfully challenge capital and how production is oriented. So we're really, when in our initial remarks talking about unions getting behind important campaigns like People's Bailout, Green New Deal, delivering community power, these are ways of sort of packaging these very complex ideas of reshaping economy in tangible ways that people could immediately relate to. So like this idea of postal banking, although, you know, it's a really friendly, cute idea on its forefront, is really quite a threat to the banking elite of Canada and international finance interests that are established in Canada, right? So it's simple ideas like that that are put forward by working people, empowering working class organizations that are, in theory, more democratically accountable and responsible to actual people in the world as opposed to elites. I think these are the ways that, although they might not address the problems immediately, need to be considered as like the next steps that we take. So I would just offer that.
I agree with exactly what Roland said and Emily. Both were brilliant. And I think that what our job is now is to really to challenge that logic of capitalism, both in terms of what work is actually valuable and who creates value, but that sort of endless profit seeking, and to remove that profit incentive from as many areas of life as we can. And so a lot of the things that we're talking about are actually taking out the austerity, taking out the corporations, that endless drive for profit, and putting it back into the public sphere, where that's actually not the main goal. The main goal is actually well-being and healing and things that make life worth living. And I think we need to be strategic and look at openings where we can do that and create that sphere where we're always shrinking the role of market and the profit incentive. We're not at the point of a revolution right now, so we need to think about how do we actually take that profit out in as many areas as we can.
All right, thank you all. I'm going to try to combine a few questions, and I guess one question that infamously comes up at every event is the kind of "what can I do" question, but I'm going to refine that a little bit and say, I mean, there are lots of options for us all as far as the tactics we use, but I guess for attendees that are listening to this, what kinds of things do our panelists find are some of the most effective ways of trying to realize the ideas that we're talking about and force policymakers to adopt them? And to sort of add in a couple of things from questions to what I've said so far. I have one question about the role of electoral politics. So I think it'd be useful for our panelists to reflect on kind of what, in your view, is the value of engaging in trying to elect different people, and how does that play into the dynamic of what you think is most effective when it comes to pushing our ideas forward? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Just because no one else seems to want to, I'll jump in here. Just again, from the perspective of labor, if you are a union member, in my opinion, so many labor unions have just been quite stagnant for so long. There's not a lot of excitement like, maybe there's some listeners on this call that your union is like really invigorated. You have a lot of people coming out to GMMs. I'm very proud of our local. We've really turned it around, say, from a year ago. But in my experience, unions are really struggling to get that engagement from members. So on the one hand, that's a sad state of affairs, but on the other hand, it's a tremendous opportunity. So if you're a union member, there's a lot of opportunities for you to appeal to other people that think the organization could do more, to be going to general members meetings, because that is the highest authority of unions, to be just putting forward motions, putting forward policy, getting involved in committees, just doing that recruitment work to just spread that messaging. And if if you're in various social justice or civil society organizations, reach out to unions and pressure them to be doing more, because they're quite susceptible to that pressure. So you could do that. Just quickly to address the whole nature of electoral politics, it's kind of in tandem with the problem of unions. If unions are sacrificing their ability to mobilize in an effort to do better proceduralism or better bureaucracy, the same critique can be made of the NDP. There's a lot of potential there for it to be more than just an electoral apparatus. It could be more integrated in movements. Just in the Alberta context, does the NDP play that role? No, I don't think any of us have an illusion that they do. And I think it was a tremendous mistake for Labour to take their foot off the neck of the NDP when they were in government. That was precisely the time to be leveraging and pushing. And I hope we could all learn from that example, so that if we ever do get a quote unquote progressive government back in Alberta, is like, that's our opportunity to keep pushing. So there is potential for the Party of Labor. And the reason I say that for the NDP is because a lot of people from unions and other progressive organizations are baked right into the membership of that party. So in theory, there should be a lot of leverage there, but that only happens if we're willing to maintain that critical support. Just because they're our team doesn't mean you give them a free pass for whatever they do. You have to demand more from them. So at this critical moment of when they're going to be setting up to take on Kenny in the next election, it's like, are we going to let them just sort of coast in on their only platform being that we're not Kenny, or are we going to try and push them to demand more? Like, I remember when the LEAP was being presented as a policy piece at one of the Alberta NDP conventions, and like, you know, the party apparatus did their best to shoot that down and disenfranchise anyone attached to it. That's one of those examples of you're alienating your base for what purpose, right? So anyway, all of that to say that these organizations are prone to pressure, but only if we're involved to create that pressure.
I think building on that, like, I think if you can organize your workplace, the LEAP recently unionized largely thanks to James's hard work. But also, like, to me, I think it looks like saying, like, how well do you know your neighbors? Have you talked to your neighbors? Do you know them? When we talk about abolishing the police, that means having strong communities. So if you are not going to call the police when something happens, who are you going to call? Are there people in your life that you can call? Are there neighbors? Are there relationships that you need to build in order for you to like build that world? And so I think, to me, that is a first step, is saying it's not enough for us to say that we are no longer going to call police, though none of us ever should. It's to say, what are our alternatives to policing, and how are we making sure that every single day we are making those alternatives stronger? Another thing is, when it comes to like electoral politics, I think electoralism is a tactic. And I feel like it's a tactic that the left has a tendency to rely on indiscriminately, instead of actually gauging its efficacy half the time. So I think about the fact that like there are a number of progressive politicians who have run on progressive platforms, and then when they're elected, govern from the center, right? Like a key example is someone, like, quite honestly, like Trisha Esterbrooks, who ran on a progressive platform, said that she was accountable to progressives, and then yesterday didn't vote to suspend the SRO program, despite the fact that there was an incredible amount of pressure from the communities that she says that she's accountable to. So I think that when we talk about electoral politics, it's not enough to just elect a progressive politician. We have to have the systems in place in order to hold them accountable once they've been elected. Otherwise, I quite frankly think there's other better ways that we can organize to engage in change. Because I'm not interested in running a politician every 4 years and then every 4 years being like, oh, we made a mistake. This person actually isn't doing the things that we thought they were going to do.
If I can build off that too, I think Batul made some excellent points. I'm just thinking about this. Like, I believe in electoral politics as an avenue for struggle, because I think it'd be foolish to disregard it, but I don't think we should put all of our eggs in that basket. I think there's a lot to be gained, but only if we're doing so from a base of power. That is a base of people organizing in their communities and in their workplaces that can hold decision makers accountable. I do want to also compliment one thing that Roland said, because I think he's selling himself a bit short. The work that the Edmonton local is doing is actually really incredible, because they've been training up organizers, skilled and dedicated organizers, and actually going around and holding referendums on defying back to work legislation at a workplace by workplace by workplace, really doing a bottom-up empowering approach to that. And the other thing I'll say is that I draw a lot of parallels to the current situation in Alberta, to where here in Ontario, we were in the Mike Harris government in the early 90s, right? With the Bob Rae NDP government, we had a majority. He promised all sorts of things and delivered on essentially none, and attacked workers, forced wage cuts, forced unpaid holidays, back to work legislation, all that, and got turfed out. And then the Mike Harris government came in and led massive austerity. oversaw a lot of the privatization that is now affecting the province today. And because of that, we saw student groups, environmentalists, anti-poverty groups, as well as labor unions come together for days of action that rotated around the province. And actually, workers went on single-day strikes, leading to some of the biggest demonstrations in Ontario's history. And just at the point where they were about to actually, what I would say, almost topple the Mike Harris government, there was a massive split in the House of Labour in Ontario and the OFL, in which half the unions actually walked out and boycotted the process, because after being so betrayed by Bob Rae's NDP government, half the unions didn't want to throw all their weight behind the NDP and instead wanted to do mass mobilization. But that quickly got shut down. There was like a walkout. And so the days of action quickly lost steam, and Mike Harris was elected with another full majority to another term. So I think that I take that perspective a lot about how we engage with electoral politics.
Great, thank you all for those answers. Continuing with a somewhat similar theme, one thing that James raised in his opening remarks was talking about the importance of people having hope to push for something better, and that there's been some success with that. But I see former MLA David Swan asking a few questions in the chat, and one of the questions he's put in there is about confronting the pretty widespread cynicism and sense of powerlessness that many still have. And so I wondered about that dynamic, and how do our panelists think, I guess, we can effectively turn those attitudes of discouragement into something that's more hopeful to motivate them to really push for change.
I've done a ton of speaking, it feels like, so I'll let the other panelists respond.
Anybody want to jump in on that? We could leave it hanging as kind of a comment on things.
I could answer it. I guess, yeah, it sort of relates to the last question for me too, about electoral politics. And like anyone that knows me closely knows that I sort of think that settler electoral politics is like a weird religion that you all have, that you're so into, and hear like, oh, if you don't vote, you can't complain, that sort of things. And even though there's this large time between terms. So I wish that white people would engage with history and their treaty obligations as much as they're like into organizing around elections. But in terms of being hopeful right now, I think there's lots of reason to be hopeful. I feel maybe accidentally or not, like I shouldn't maybe be this hopeful about Edmonton moving beyond a world where we have police, or moving in that direction. I think in terms of working with electoral politics, I think you have to be hopeful in your personal relationships and community that you create, which is important as an alternative to electoral organizing, or imagining that as a realm of change, and also as an alternative to police. So I think in order to combat cynicism, you have to surround yourself with good people.
Great, thanks, Emily. I see Richard Mary has had his hand up for a little while, so why don't we do another audio question? Go ahead, Richard. If we can get you turned on here.
Hello? How's that?
There we go. Now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. The question that was asked was actually from a friend of mine who is...
So we can't hear you very well, Richard. If you can get closer to your mic, that might help.
Okay. All right, how's that?
That's a lot better. Go ahead.
The question that was asked was actually by a friend of mine who's with me here now, who is status Treaty 6 Indian status. And I've been working with the Council of Canadians for quite a while, and so that's why I tuned into this, and quite concerned about corporate control of everything. And and her concern, of course, is what rights traditionally treaty territories are have been controlled by the federal government, as I understand it. And her question is about, what authority do they have? Does the provincial government have to make changes now in light of the Bill 1, for example, Bill 22. Bill 1 is, I guess, the main concern here, but also Bill 22, and yeah, so that's as best as I can interpret her question. But she's concerned about provincial jurisdiction over those territories to expand development. And we just finished we got a lot of response on the parks issue, the effort to shut down the parks and to transfer to private management. But she's concerned about private intervention in treaty lands, whether they be reserves or whether they be unceded or whatever. So I don't know if there's somebody there can address that question.
Hey, thanks, Richard. Somebody want to take that one?
I can start if anyone else has. Yeah, that's a big question. I'm not a lawyer, so in talking about Bill 1, but yeah, as I talked about in my short talk, the Natural Resource Transfer Act transferred resources to provinces, which is counter to treaty. So when we think about like First Nations and the Crown at this level of politics, Alberta is here. It doesn't exist in that relationship, and so Alberta doing things like pretending to own resources or putting forward bills like Bill 1 or things that they don't have jurisdiction to do, because treaty is a greater law than Bill 1 or than Alberta's existence. So it is very concerning that they think they have this jurisdiction. I mean, we have Jason Kenney saying that there's no treaty land in Alberta at the beginning of his term too. So we know that the actions that the province take has effects on our treaty rights, but ultimately they shouldn't even be in that conversation because we're at a greater level of politics than them. And I would argue and do argue that Alberta is an illegitimate political form. So yeah, it is super concerning. We'll see what happens with Bill 1. Yeah, whether or not Bill 1 is applicable on reserve is unclear to me as federal land. But we know that most roads and railways that go through reserve land are provincial, regardless if they're on reserve. So yeah, it'll be a sticky time seeing how that plays out. But yeah, we're a bigger political entity than the province, is what I would always drive through.
Thanks, Emily. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Okay. We've got way more questions on here than we're going to have time for. So I'm going to say we've got time for 2 more. I'm going to take one of Vasil's questions from the Q&A that is really about the dynamics between online activism and in-person organizing. So I think it's easy for lots of folks to do posting on social media and that kind of activism. And while I think everybody will agree that there's a place for that, what are our panelists' thoughts on, I guess, the need for in-person organizing and the effectiveness dynamic between those 2 different forms?
Joel, I think you kind of alluded to the answer already, but just to drill down on that a bit, it's social media has been an indispensable tool for sharing information. And as like a union organizer, I'm grateful to have any resource I can to share information with my members. But I think we could just look at, we've had the ability to share that information. So why hasn't it resulted in this capacity for, say, our our organizations to actually mobilize on the floor. So a real sea change for our approach in Edmonton is like, again, we always have these abilities, this ability to share that information, but the sea change was really going to the work floors, having those meetings, building those connections with people, like putting an application in their hand and saying like, here's an education that the union is paying you to get on board with taking this course, which will help us be more powerful as an organization. And then those people going to those courses, meeting other people, and then all those people being supported throughout that whole process, and then being able to do job action with this group of allies and activists that have been forged together through these relationships. And you can't do that online. Like, I mean, posting, I know everyone enjoys it to a certain extent, but it's not the same as doing that work, which can be very uncomfortable, right? And especially if we're in the process, like engaging in the prospect of change, like the uncomfortable reality of that is that we have to engage with people that aren't necessarily already in our comfort zone or already believe the things that we believe, right? And social media is very effective at putting us into these echo chambers or these bubbles where we often hear the same things that we believe in coming right back at us. But if the process of organizing is ultimately a process of change, then that comes into winning over the people that aren't already with us, and you are not going to do that online. You could only be doing that in person.
I think I want to add to that a little bit. I feel like the binary between online and in-person organizing is kind of fake, in the sense that I think in lots of ways, like for a lot of people for whom like our traditional organizing structures have left behind because of like ableism, digital organizing and online methods of engagement are like one of the only ways that they are able to engage, or like is the only pathway that our movements have provided for them to engage. And so I think that failure is on us as organizers. Because of that, like I think that like we can all talk about the efficacy of social media and the fact that like, yes, we're depending on algorithms developed by corporations in order to like get the word out. And I think that like I feel like I've learned a lot from like disability justice advocates and organizers in my life about how like online and in screen is no less valid or real than in person. And I think that like the pandemic in particular has really illustrated that for lots of us, is that like we are just as present right now with each other as we would have been if we were in a room together. Even if that presence can look different, it's no more or less real.
Some great points there. Okay, so like I said, we just have time for one more question. And I'm going to go on the audio to Cole Rockarts. So go ahead, Cole.
Hi there. My question's for Roland, but would love to hear from anyone if they have thoughts. I was wondering if you know of what unions in Edmonton or specific union members are actively doing to get cops out of the labor movement, and if COP W in particular is doing work around this. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so just the nature of our union, since we're a federal union, we don't really have the same sort of, I guess, influence or presence when it comes to these Albertan or even civic issues. For our part, both our national union and our local have issued statements in support of Black Lives Matter and calling for defunding of police. So, like, I mean, police are the natural enemy of the working class. Like anytime the unions are trying to improve the lives of their members, they inevitably hit that wall of law enforcement. And although police are mostly recruited from the working class, as soon as they join that institution, the interests of that institution are very much against the project of working class empowerment, whether it's workers trying to organize or whether it's unions trying to push for change in society. So I'm ignorant of the relationship. I don't believe any of the police associations are part of the House of Labor. If they were, I'd hope they'd be kicked out immediately, just because, again, they're enemies of the working class. Doesn't mean that individual cops are necessarily bad, but again, that institution is not is not going to be doing us any favors. They're the first obstacle. And like I'm already thinking about the next time I get legislated back to work, it's going to be RCMP boots and Edmonton police boots, like trying to drag me away. So I can't see them as being allies to our struggle at all. But labor has a tremendous role to play in challenging this power paradigm. Like just imagine what would happen. It's like if we, like just the other day, and the other panelists have discussed this to an extent where there was a vote on whether or not police officers should be pulled out of public schools as SROs. And that vote ended up being split 4-4, and therefore, we're still going to have cops in our schools. Now, imagine that labor was more active around this issue, or organizing around this issue, and pressuring these city councilors, because the city councilors, they're not bastions of like ideological purity. It's like, look at Esther Brooks, right? She campaigned a certain way, and then she just turned coat like so many other politicians before. But imagine that she was actively afraid of like losing her position, right? The only thing that you could really hold a politician to account on is self-preservation. So really, like, push them. But I think that's a respectful challenge for labor to do more and create that pressure. So our locals tried to create that pressure, but we're not in as good position to create that influence, but we're trying from where we are.
I'll just add on to Roland's comments to say that I don't think there are any police unions in the House of Labour, that is in the Canadian Labour Congress, or any of the affiliates, but there are actually cops and RCMP officers represented by my union, by the Canadian Union of Public Employees that the LABE is unionized with, as well as the Public Servants Alliance of Canada represents, I believe, correctional officers and border services. And so I think Roland hit the nail on the head. Cops are not workers. They are the armed enforcement of capital, which workers have to come up against when they're pushing for that redistribution of wealth downwards and towards our members. And I think that Roland's right. We need to be pushing for that. I know that the CUPE Ontario Convention last year had a huge debate about this. I look forward to finally being able to attend as a member next year and talking about it. And I think there's so much we could be doing right now if we're actually defunding the police. There's a whole bunch of alternatives you could talk about, but as Batul mentioned brilliantly, there are so much more we could do with it. Here in Ottawa, 20% of the whole budget for the municipality goes towards police services. That could actually provide so many things. And yeah. And if I probably this is the last word, if I could throw in just a throwaway comment, one of the most exciting things that I'm inspired by in the United States right now is something called the Bargaining for the Common Good approach and organization. And they're doing a whole bunch of stuff about putting social justice, racial justice, climate justice on the bargaining table. But one thing in particular that they've done is to take all contract expirations that they can find over the next 2 years in the United States and start mapping them out together, both based on location and timeline, so that they can start syncing up together and combining in solidarity strikes, combining with allies, and they're putting that on a map. And I think that's something that could be incredibly powerful in Alberta, and would love to support any of that.
Awesome, thank you. As I said, that was our last question. I do want to, in case any of our panelists have any other concluding thoughts, James gave a few there. Anybody feel like there's anything that they have to get in before we wrap up? We talked about a lot of things, so it's totally okay if you don't. Emily?
Yeah, if you're in Edmonton, go to the Black Lives Matter YEG website and read about their plan for the abolition of EPS, because that's which everyone's priority should be this week. Thanks.
One more thing to that. Also, a Black Lives Matter Edmonton campaign. Habitat for Humanity is evicting almost 51 Black families at the end of the month, reneging on an agreement that they had made with these families to provide interest-free mortgages in exchange for, I want to say, 500 hours of labor. So these families built their homes with their hands and are now being evicted out of these homes. And so there is like actions being planned around demanding that Habitat honor their original agreement. And so like this is a crucial part about what a people's bailout and about what like racial justice in this territory can look like, is demanding that like Black folks retain their homes.
Wow. Okay, that wraps us up then. I want to give a big thank you to all of our speakers. Normally you'd hear an audience clapping at this point, which I'm sure everybody is sort of in spirit. It is obviously important for us all to get together, even if we're only able to virtually like this and discuss ideas. It's also important that we take those and do something with them. So I really encourage everybody who's participated today to get out into your communities, and as one of our panelists said earlier, get to know your neighbors and talk about some of these things. That's the only way that we really see effective change happen, is if we spread the word about it. I also want to thank everybody that's been involved, especially behind the scenes in organizing this, our tech folks that have been making sure that this runs smoothly, which I'm thankful that it did. And on behalf of Public Interest Alberta and the Council of Canadians, we've been your co-hosting organizations tonight. Thanks to all of you for watching and for interacting throughout the event. And sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Clearly there was a lot of interest in these topics and these panelists. So thanks so much for your patience with us and for being a part of this tonight. So hope to see you around in some form. Have a good night, everybody.